Some countries are no longer independent economic actors. They've become hostages, collateral held between competing great powers who each prevent the other from gaining decisive influence. Pakistan needs IMF financing to avoid default, but China demands debt repayment that makes IMF programs impossible. Ukraine needs reconstruction funding, but Western aid requires compromises with Russia that Russia opposes, and Russian support requires abandoning the West. Taiwan's semiconductor dominance makes it indispensable to both China and America, trapping it between powers who can't let Taiwan fully align with their rival. Lebanon's economy depends on Iranian financing through Hezbollah and Western support through central banking, with each side blocking the other from gaining control. These aren't just difficult economic situations. They're hostage economies. Countries whose survival depends on support from competing powers who each use that dependence to prevent the rival from gaining influence. And as the world fragments into competing blocs, more countries will find themselves trapped in this impossible position where saying yes to one power means punishment from the other, but saying no to either means collapse. Understanding hostage economies requires examining how they emerge, why traditional economic logic doesn't apply, and what happens when countries cannot make independent decisions about their own survival. Pakistan provides the clearest example of a fully developed hostage economy. Pakistan faces chronic balance of payments crises requiring external financing to avoid default. The IMF can provide that financing, but attaches conditions requiring fiscal discipline, currency devaluation, subsidy removal, and importantly, reducing dependence on Chinese lending. These are standard IMF structural adjustment requirements designed to restore economic sustainability. But Pakistan cannot comply with IMF requirements without alienating China, which has invested over $62 billion in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. CPEC includes power plants, highways, railways, and the Gwadar port, infrastructure that Pakistani economic development now depends on. The projects were financed through Chinese loans that Pakistan must repay. If Pakistan reduces Chinese debt as IMF requires, China can threaten to halt ongoing projects, withdraw technical support, and cut off financing for new development. The trap is structural. Pakistan needs IMF money to avoid immediate default, but accepting IMF conditions means reducing Chinese debt, which China interprets as alignment with Western pressure. China can retaliate by making CPEC debt immediately due, withdrawing ongoing project support, or simply stopping new investment. But if Pakistan refuses IMF conditions to maintain Chinese relationship, it doesn't receive IMF financing and faces default anyway. Pakistan is economically hostage between IMF and China. Neither side will provide unconditional support. Each uses Pakistan's desperation to extract concessions and prevent the rival from gaining influence. Pakistan cannot say yes to both because their requirements contradict. It cannot say no to either because collapse follows. Every decision deepens dependency on whoever Pakistan chooses while antagonizing the alternative. There is no independent Pakistani economic policy, only choosing which hostage takers' demands to prioritize. The numbers reveal the impossibility. Pakistan's foreign reserves in late 2024 covered approximately 6 weeks of imports. Default was imminent without external financing. The IMF offered $7 billion over 3 years contingent on reforms. But Pakistan owes China approximately $30 billion in CPEC-related debt, with repayments accelerating over the next decade. Servicing Chinese debt while implementing IMF austerity was mathematically impossible without economic collapse or Chinese debt restructuring. The fiscal mathematics exposed the trap. Pakistan's government revenue totals approximately $50 billion annually. Debt servicing requires $25 billion, including $12 billion for Chinese CPEC debt. This leaves $25 billion for all government operations: military, education, healthcare, subsidies, infrastructure. The IMF requires removing fuel subsidies, $6 billion annually, electricity subsidies, $4 billion, reducing military spending, and raising revenue through taxes. These reforms would theoretically create fiscal space for debt service, but implementing these reforms creates political crisis. Fuel subsidy removal increases transportation costs immediately. Electricity subsidy cuts mean blackouts expand from 8 hours to potentially 12 or 16 hours daily. Tax increases hit middle class already struggling with 30% plus inflation. The political backlash threatens government stability, and Chinese debt still requires $12 billion annually, regardless of IMF reforms. The reforms don't eliminate the impossible choice. They just shift pain from one constituency to another, while China continues demanding repayment. The timeline compounds pressure. IMF programs require quarterly reviews assessing compliance. If Pakistan fails any review, IMF suspends financing. CPEC debt repayments peak between 2025-2030, exactly when IMF program operates. Pakistan must simultaneously satisfy IMF quarterly requirements and Chinese annual debt payments. If Pakistan prioritizes IMF compliance, Chinese debt goes unpaid. If Pakistan prioritizes Chinese debt, IMF reviews fail. But China won't restructure debt on terms IMF accepts, because that would validate IMF leverage over Chinese lending, and IMF won't provide financing if Pakistan continues accumulating Chinese debt, because that money indirectly services Chinese loans rather than reforming Pakistani economy. Pakistan is trapped between contradictory requirements from powers who both claim to be partners but act as rival creditors competing for influence. The political dimension compounds the economic trap. Pakistan's military establishment has deep ties to China through arms purchases and strategic cooperation. Pakistan's civilian government faces pressure from IMF through Western diplomatic channels. When Pakistan's government negotiates with IMF, the military signals displeasure to China. When the military strengthens Chinese ties, Western governments threaten to reduce aid and investment. Pakistan's internal politics become battleground for external powers competing for influence through economic leverage. Ukraine demonstrates a different variant of hostage economy, where war creates the trap. Ukraine needs approximately $200 billion for reconstruction after Russian invasion destroyed infrastructure, displaced millions, and collapsed economic output. Ukraine cannot generate this financing internally. It depends entirely on external support for economic survival and reconstruction. Western nations offer financing but attach conditions. The primary condition, though not always stated explicitly, is that Ukraine maintain resistance to Russian territorial demands and continue alignment with Western institutions. Reconstruction aid is implicitly contingent on Ukraine not making peace deals that the West views as capitulation to Russian aggression. This is reasonable from Western perspective. Why finance reconstruction if Ukraine simply accepts Russian demands afterward? But Russia offers an alternative. Russia can end the war immediately if Ukraine accepts territorial concessions and abandons NATO aspirations. From Russian perspective, they would then support reconstruction of areas under Ukrainian control as part of broader normalization. Russia has financing capacity and proximity to provide reconstruction support efficiently if political alignment follows. Ukraine is economically hostage between these alternatives. Western reconstruction aid requires continued conflict or peace terms Russia won't accept. Russian reconstruction support requires territorial concessions and political alignment the West opposes. Ukraine cannot access financing from both simultaneously because the conditions contradict. Ukrainian leadership must choose which power's requirements to prioritize, knowing that choice determines Ukraine's political and economic future for decades. The human cost is enormous. Ukrainian cities remain destroyed, refugees cannot return, economic activity stays suppressed, all while potential reconstruction financing sits unused because accessing it requires political concessions to one side that alienates the other. The hostage economy isn't just constraining, it's preventing reconstruction that everyone claims to support because neither side will provide unconditional assistance. Taiwan presents the most strategically significant hostage economy because Taiwan's semiconductor industry makes it indispensable to global technology supply chains. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company produces over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Every smartphone, computer, data center, weapons system, and AI application depends on TSMC production. This creates unique economic dynamics where Taiwan's value as hostage exceeds its value as ally to either side. The technical specifics reveal the dependency. TSMC manufactures chips at 3-nanometer process node, technology that only TSMC has achieved at commercial scale. Intel and Samsung produce 5-nanometer chips but struggle to match TSMC's yield rates and performance. The 3-nanometer chips power Apple's latest iPhones, AMD's processors, NVIDIA's AI chips, and Qualcomm's 5G modems. TSMC's fab facilities in Taiwan produce approximately 12 million wafers annually worth over $70 billion. Replacing this capacity would require building multiple fabs costing $20 and $30 billion each, with 5-year construction timelines. The supply chain integration means TSMC disruption cascades globally. Apple cannot ship iPhones without TSMC chips. NVIDIA cannot produce AI accelerators. AMD cannot compete in processor markets. The automotive industry faces chip shortages affecting millions of vehicles. The Pentagon cannot procure advanced weapons systems. When COVID reduced TSMC output by 10% in 2021, global semiconductor shortage cost the economy hundreds of billions. Complete TSMC loss would be catastrophic. The United States cannot allow Taiwan to fall under Chinese control because losing TSMC access would cripple American technology industries and military capabilities. This creates absolute commitment to Taiwan's defense that goes beyond strategic positioning or alliance politics. American economic security directly depends on maintaining Taiwan's independence from China. This makes Taiwan economically valuable as partner, but also makes Taiwan dependent on American security guarantees. China cannot allow Taiwan to formalize independence or deepen American military integration, because Taiwan reunification is core to Chinese national identity and legitimacy. But China also cannot risk military action that destroys TSMC facilities, because China's own technology industries depend on Taiwan's semiconductor access. China needs Taiwan economically functional, even as China opposes Taiwan's political status. This creates contradictory Chinese interests, where preserving Taiwan's economic value limits military options. Taiwan is economically hostage to both. Taiwan depends on American security guarantees for protection from Chinese military pressure. But Taiwan also depends on Chinese economic access. Over 40% of Taiwan's exports go to China and Hong Kong. Taiwan cannot fully align with America without China imposing economic costs. Taiwan cannot accommodate Chinese political demands without America questioning security commitments. Taiwan must maintain impossible balance between powers who both need Taiwan but cannot allow Taiwan to fully align with their rival. The semiconductor dimension amplifies the trap because Taiwan's value comes from TSMC facilities that could be destroyed in conflict. This creates strange stability where Taiwan's vulnerability is protective. If China invades and destroys TSMC, China loses the economic asset it wants to control and proves that reunification destroys rather than preserves value. If America abandons Taiwan and TSMC falls under Chinese control, American technology industries face catastrophic supply disruption. Both outcomes are catastrophic for the power that allows them, so both powers are trapped into preserving status quo that neither prefers. Taiwan's government understands this dynamic and uses it strategically. Taiwan maintains just enough independence to require American protection while avoiding provocations that would force American military commitment. Taiwan maintains just enough economic integration with China to make Chinese military action economically devastating while avoiding political concessions that would weaken American support. Taiwan is hostage, but Taiwan leverages that status to maximize autonomy within constraints neither power will allow Taiwan to escape. Lebanon demonstrates hostage economy emerging from internal political fragmentation. Lebanon's economy collapsed in 2019 through combination of government corruption, unsustainable debt, and capital flight. Lebanese pound lost over 95% of its value. Banks froze deposits. Electricity and fuel became scarce. Lebanon needed massive external financing for stabilization and reconstruction. The collapse mechanics were severe. Lebanon's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeded 150%. The central bank had operated a Ponzi scheme for years, offering commercial banks high interest rates to maintain dollar peg. When the scheme collapsed, banks froze accounts to prevent bank runs. Lebanese citizens who had dollar deposits found them trapped, convertible only at massive losses to local currency. The pound, which traded at 1/500 to the dollar on official markets, collapsed to over 15,000 on black markets, a 90% plus devaluation. The electricity crisis became catastrophic. State electricity operates only 2 hours daily. Citizens depend on private generators costing $100, $200 monthly, often exceeding incomes. Fuel shortages meant generator operators couldn't maintain supply. Hospitals lost power. Businesses closed. The infrastructure collapse stemmed from decades of corruption where government monopolies extracted rents without maintaining services, financed through debt that became unsustainable. The August 2020 Beirut port explosion that killed over 200 and destroyed much of the city revealed the governance failure. Ammonium nitrate stored improperly for years because regulatory agencies were captured by political factions who each blocked oversight that might expose rivals. The explosion was manifestation of systemic collapse, where state institutions served factional interests rather than public welfare. But Lebanon's internal politics are divided between factions aligned with different external powers. Hezbollah, the most powerful political and military force, receives financing and support from Iran. Hezbollah uses that support to provide services, electricity, healthcare, education, that government cannot deliver. This makes substantial Lebanese population dependent on Iranian financing flowing through Hezbollah. But Lebanon's central bank, commercial banking system, and government finances require Western support. The IMF, World Bank, European Union, and Gulf Arab states can provide financing for economic stabilization, but they require reforms targeting corruption and requiring Hezbollah to reduce political and military influence. These requirements directly threaten Iran's position in Lebanon. The trap is that Lebanon cannot receive Western financing without reducing Hezbollah influence. But reducing Hezbollah influence means losing Iranian support that provides services to Lebanese population. Iran won't continue financing if Lebanon implements reforms strengthening Western-aligned government at Hezbollah's expense. The West won't provide financing if Iran maintains influence through Hezbollah. Lebanon is hostage between powers who each prevent the other from stabilizing Lebanese economy. The result is that Lebanon receives inadequate financing from multiple sources, each conditional on political alignment that alienates others. Economic collapse continues because no single power will provide unconditional support, and accepting conditional support from one power triggers retaliation from rivals. Lebanese population suffers not because financing is unavailable, but because accessing it requires political, impossible concessions. The historical context shows hostage economies aren't new. Cold War created similar dynamics. Countries like Egypt, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia navigated between US and Soviet support, extracting resources from both by threatening to align with the rival. But Cold War hostage economies operated differently because both superpowers were willing to provide support to prevent the rival from gaining influence. The competition created leverage for hostage countries. Egypt under Nasser demonstrated the dynamic perfectly. Egypt accepted Soviet military aid and economic support while also receiving American food aid and development assistance. When one superpower threatened to reduce support, Egypt could credibly threaten to deepen ties with the rival. The 1956 Suez Crisis showed both superpowers opposing British-French-Israeli intervention partly to compete for Egyptian alignment. Egypt leveraged this competition to finance the Aswan Dam. When Western financing was withdrawn, Soviet support followed immediately. Yugoslavia's Tito mastered non-aligned positioning between blocs. Yugoslavia received Western economic aid specifically because American policymakers wanted to prevent Yugoslavia from returning to Soviet orbit after the 1948 Tito-Stalin split. Yugoslavia simultaneously maintained enough Soviet relationship to keep the threat of reconciliation credible. This allowed Yugoslavia to extract resources from both sides, far exceeding what Yugoslav's strategic importance would otherwise justify. Indonesia under Sukarno similarly balanced American and Soviet support through the 1950s and early 1960s. American aid programs competed with Soviet military assistance and development projects. Each superpower provided support specifically to prevent Indonesia from fully aligning with the rival. This gave Indonesia leverage to extract better terms from both. The key difference was that Cold War superpowers competed by offering better terms and more generous support. Contemporary powers increasingly demand exclusive alignment rather than competing to prevent the rival from gaining influence. Great powers increasingly demand exclusive alignment rather than competing to prevent the rival from gaining influence. The IMF won't finance Pakistan if Chinese debt continues accumulating. IMF demands Pakistan choose. China won't restructure debt if Pakistan implements IMF reforms. China demands Pakistan choose. Neither side competes by offering better terms. Both compete by demanding exclusive alignment and threatening to withdraw if the rival maintains influence. This makes contemporary hostage economies more constrained than Cold War equivalents. During the Cold War, countries could play superpowers against each other by threatening to switch alignment. Pakistan could threaten to accept Soviet support to extract better American terms or vice versa. Contemporary powers don't compete on terms. They demand exclusive alignment and withdraw if excluded. Hostage countries lose the leverage that made the position survivable historically. The multipolar transition amplifies these dynamics. As the world fragments into competing blocs, more countries will face pressure to choose sides. But many countries have economic relationships with multiple blocs that they cannot easily sever. They need Chinese investment, American technology, and European markets simultaneously. As bloc competition intensifies, maintaining relationships with all becomes impossible because each bloc demands exclusivity. Countries in Southeast Asia face this emerging trap. They need Chinese investment for infrastructure, American security guarantees against Chinese pressure, and access to both markets for exports. As U.S.-China competition intensifies, maintaining balanced relationships becomes impossible. Vietnam needs American support to resist Chinese territorial claims, but also needs Chinese infrastructure investment and market access. The Philippines needs American military protection, but Chinese economic engagement. Indonesia needs Chinese financing, but American technology. Each faces emerging pressure to choose sides in ways that create hostage dynamics. The Middle East shows similar patterns. Saudi Arabia needs American security guarantees but Chinese oil purchases. UAE needs Western financial services but Chinese infrastructure investment. The traditional strategy of balancing relationships between powers works only if powers tolerate balancing. As competition intensifies and powers demand exclusive alignment, the balancing strategy becomes impossible and countries become hostages. The economic development dimension makes hostage dynamics particularly severe for developing countries. Developing countries need enormous infrastructure investment, technology transfer, and market access to develop economically. No single power provides all three. China provides infrastructure financing but limited technology transfer. America provides technology but limited infrastructure financing. Europe provides market access but limited investment capital. Optimal development requires accessing support from all, but rising bloc competition makes that impossible. So developing countries must choose which development needs to prioritize and which power support to accept, knowing that choice constrains future options. A country that accepts Chinese infrastructure financing finds American technology transfer restricted. A country that aligns with American technology access finds Chinese infrastructure financing withdrawn. The choice itself creates the hostage dynamic where neither side will provide unconditional support, and each punishes cooperation with rivals. The irreversibility matters because infrastructure, technology, and trade relationships create path dependencies that are difficult to reverse. A country that built infrastructure using Chinese financing remains dependent on Chinese supply chains for decades. A country that integrated American technology faces enormous switching costs to alternatives. The initial choice of which power to align with creates structural dependencies that persist regardless of changing preferences. The question is whether hostage economies can escape, or whether the trap closes permanently once countries become dependent on competing powers. The evidence suggests escape is extraordinarily difficult. Pakistan has tried to balance IMF and Chinese demands for years and only deepened the trap. Lebanon has attempted reform programs that would satisfy Western requirements while maintaining Iranian relationships and failed repeatedly. Taiwan cannot escape semiconductor centrality without destroying the economic value that makes Taiwan strategically important. The escape mechanisms that existed historically have closed. During the Cold War, hostage countries could threaten to switch sides credibly because both superpowers would accept defectors from the rival bloc. Contemporary bloc competition is harder. China won't accept countries with strong American military ties. America won't fully engage countries with deep Chinese economic integration. The option to genuinely switch sides doesn't exist because neither bloc accepts partial alignment. The debt trap reinforces hostage status. Countries that accumulated debt from one power cannot access financing from rivals to repay the original creditor. IMF won't provide money that flows to China. China won't restructure debt if countries align with IMF. The debt itself becomes the chain binding countries to their creditor, who can use debt obligations to block escape to rivals. The infrastructure lock-in discussed earlier compounds this. Countries with Chinese infrastructure depend on Chinese supply chains for decades. Even if they wanted to diversify away from Chinese economic relationships, the infrastructure investments made that practically impossible. The physical infrastructure becomes permanent hostage-taking mechanism. The strategic insight is that hostage economies emerge not from countries being weak or poorly governed, though that contributes, but from structural contradictions when countries depend on competing powers for survival. As the world fragments into competing blocs demanding exclusive alignment, more countries will find themselves hostage between powers who each use economic dependence to prevent rivals from gaining influence. The hostage economy isn't an exception. It's the emerging normal for countries caught between competing powers who won't provide unconditional support.